The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Pete Rose's modest apartment in Cincinnati, each drop echoing the rhythm of his restless thoughts. Once, this same rain would have excited him. Perfect weather for sliding into home plate, he used to think. Now, at 62, Pete sat in his worn leather recliner, staring at the collection of baseball memorabilia that lined his living room walls like monuments to a life that felt increasingly distant. The morning light filtered through thin curtains, casting long shadows across framed photographs of his glory days with the Cincinnati Reds. There he was in 1975, arms raised in triumph after breaking Ty Cobb's all-time hits record. There was the 1976 World Series championship team photo, his face beaming with the confidence of a man who believed the world was his oyster. But those photographs felt like artifacts from someone else's life now. Pete's phone buzzed on the coffee table, interrupting his melancholic reverie. The caller ID showed Margaret Stevens, Lincoln Elementary. He recognized the name, the principal who had been persistently trying to reach him for weeks about some school visit. Pete had been avoiding her calls, not because he didn't want to help, but because he wasn't sure he had anything valuable left to offer anyone, especially children. "Mr. Rose?" Margaret's voice was warm, but tinged with the kind of exhaustion that comes from working in an underfunded urban school. "I hope I'm not bothering you, but I wanted to try one more time. Our kids would really benefit from hearing your story." Pete rubbed his stubbled chin, glancing at the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen counter. His pension was modest, and the speaking engagements had dried up years ago after his gambling scandal. The baseball world had largely forgotten him, or worse, remembered him only for his failures. "Mrs. Stevens, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for this," Pete replied, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had heard too many doors slam shut. "These kids deserve better role models than someone like me. Mr. Rose." Margaret's tone became more insistent. "Our students at Lincoln Elementary come from families that know struggle intimately. Many of them have parents working 2 or 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. They don't need perfect role models. They need real ones. They need to see that people can make mistakes and still find ways to matter, still find ways to give back." Pete was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak down his window. In the distance, he could see the Cincinnati skyline, the city where he had once been king. Now he felt more like an exile in his own hometown. "What would you want me to talk about?" he asked finally. "Whatever you think would help them," Margaret replied. "Perseverance, maybe, hard work, the importance of education. These kids face challenges you and I probably can't imagine, but they have the same dreams as any other children. They want to believe that their circumstances don't have to define their futures." Pete thought about his own childhood in Cincinnati's West Side, not far from where Lincoln Elementary now stood. His father, Harry, had worked in a local bank and instilled in Pete the values of dedication and persistence. Charlie Hustle, they had called him, because he ran to first base even on routine groundouts. That nickname had defined his entire career. The player who gave everything he had on every single play. "When would you need me?" Pete asked, surprising himself with his own words. "Next Friday afternoon would be perfect. We're having our monthly assembly, and it would mean the world to these kids to hear from someone who grew up right here in Cincinnati and made it to the top of their profession." After hanging up, Pete sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. He thought about what Margaret had said, that these kids needed to see that people could make mistakes and still matter. Pete had made plenty of mistakes, certainly. The gambling, the lies, the way he had handled his exile from baseball. But maybe, just maybe, there was still something of value in his story. Maybe Charlie Hustle wasn't completely dead after all. The next few days passed slowly as Pete prepared for his visit to Lincoln Elementary. He dug through boxes of old photographs and newspaper clippings, trying to piece together a presentation that would resonate with young minds. He practiced in front of his bathroom mirror, feeling awkward and uncertain. It had been years since he had spoken to a group of children, and he wasn't sure he remembered how to connect with them. On Thursday evening, Pete drove through the neighborhood surrounding Lincoln Elementary. The area had changed dramatically since his youth. Many of the houses showed signs of neglect, peeling paint, overgrown yards, boarded-up windows. Corner stores were protected by thick security glass, and several lots sat empty where buildings had once stood. This was urban Cincinnati in decline, a far cry from the prosperous neighborhoods where Pete had spent his later years as a player. But there were also signs of resilience. Community gardens sprouted between buildings, their autumn vegetables still producing food for local families. A barbershop displayed a hand-painted sign reading, "Dreams come true here." Children played on a basketball court where someone had painted inspirational messages along the baseline. "Stay in school. Believe in yourself. Your neighborhood doesn't define you." As Pete parked in front of the school, he noticed how small and weathered the building looked. Lincoln Elementary was a two-story brick structure that had probably been built in the 1950s. The parking lot was cracked and weedy, and several windows were covered with plywood. A chain-link fence surrounded a playground where the equipment looked decades old. This was clearly a school operating on a shoestring budget, serving a community that society had largely forgotten. Pete sat in his car for several minutes, watching custodial staff arrive for evening shifts and a few teachers leaving after staying late to prepare for the next day. He wondered what these children's lives were like outside these walls. What challenges did they face that he had never had to worry about? What dreams did they harbor, despite their circumstances? Finally, Pete Rose got out of his car and walked toward the school entrance. Tomorrow, he would find out if Charlie Hustle still had something left to give. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with a bitter October wind that cut through Pete's light jacket as he approached Lincoln Elementary. The school building looked even more weathered in the harsh morning light, its brick facade stained with years of city pollution and neglect. Pete carried a small duffel bag containing some of his old baseball gear, a bat, a glove, and a few photographs he thought might interest the children. Margaret Stevens met him at the front entrance, her warm smile providing a stark contrast to the building's austere appearance. She was a woman in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that sparkled with the kind of energy that only dedicated educators possess. Despite the early hour, she looked as though she had already been working for hours. "Mr. Rose, thank you so much for coming," she said, extending her hand. "I can't tell you how excited the kids are. Some of them have been talking about nothing else all week." Glee. As they walked through the school's corridors, Pete was struck by the efforts the staff had made to create a welcoming environment despite obvious budget constraints. Student artwork covered every available wall space, creating splashes of color that brightened the aging hallways. Hand-lettered signs proclaim messages of encouragement. Reading opens doors, math is magic, science solves problems. In one display case, he saw essays titled "My Hero," featuring everyone from mothers and fathers to community volunteers and teachers. "We serve about 400 students here," Margaret explained as they passed classrooms where teachers were already engaging their pupils in morning lessons. "About 90% qualify for free or reduced-price lunch. Many of our families are dealing with unemployment, single-parent households, and all the challenges that come with economic hardship. But these kids are incredibly resilient and hungry to learn." They paused outside a third-grade classroom where Pete could see children working intently at their desks. One little boy, probably no more than 8 years old, was carefully copying sentences from the blackboard, his tongue poking out in concentration. A girl next to him helped him with a difficult word, whispering encouragement when he got it right. "That's Marcus," Margaret said softly, noticing Pete's attention. He came to us at the beginning of the year reading significantly below grade level. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, has been working with him every day after school, and he's already made tremendous progress. These kids just need someone to believe in them. They continued down the hallway, past a cafeteria, where volunteers were already preparing lunch with ingredients that had clearly been chosen more for cost-effectiveness than gourmet appeal. Pete noticed that several adults working in the kitchen wore name tags, identifying them as parents and community volunteers. This was clearly a school where the entire community pitched in to make things work. "Our assembly is in the gymnasium," Margaret explained as they approached a set of double doors. "We don't have a proper auditorium, but we make do. The kids will be coming in shortly. We've got grades 3 through 5 attending today, so about 200 children." Vadi? The gymnasium was a modest space with a low ceiling and aged wooden floors that had been worn smooth by decades of use. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a small stage area where a podium and microphone had been set up. Banners hung from the walls celebrating various school achievements: Reading Champions 2019, Perfect Attendance Awards, Lincoln Elementary Science Fair winners. Despite the humble setting, there was an unmistakable sense of pride and community spirit. As children began filing into the gymnasium, Pete was amazed by their energy and enthusiasm. They chatted excitedly among themselves, many clearly having heard that a famous baseball player was coming to speak to them. Their teachers guided them to their seats with patient reminders about using inside voices and sitting crisscross applesauce. Pete studied their faces as they settled in. These were beautiful children, their eyes bright with curiosity and hope. But he also noticed details that spoke to their economic circumstances: clothing that was clean but clearly hand-me-down, shoes that were worn but carefully maintained, backpacks that had been repaired with duct tape. Some children wore coats indoors, suggesting that their homes might not have adequate heating. Margaret took the podium and called for attention. "Good morning, Lincoln Lions," she announced, using the school's mascot name. "Good morning, Principal Stevens," the children chorused back with impressive volume and enthusiasm. "Today, we have a very special guest," Margaret continued. "How many of you know what baseball is?" Hands shot up throughout the gymnasium, accompanied by excited chatter. Margaret called on a few students to explain the game, and Pete smiled as he listened to their enthusiastic, if sometimes inaccurate, descriptions of America's pastime. "Well, our guest today is someone who was one of the very best baseball players who ever lived," Margaret announced. "He grew up right here in Cincinnati, just like many of you. He worked very hard to achieve his dreams, and he has some important things to share with you about never giving up and always doing your best. Please give a warm Lincoln Elementary welcome to Mr. Pete Rose." The applause was thunderous for such a small space. Pete approached the podium, feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement he hadn't experienced in years. He looked out at the sea of young faces, all turned toward him with expressions of anticipation and wonder. For a moment, he was transported back to his playing days when crowds would cheer his name and hang on his every move. "Hello, Lincoln Lions," Pete began, his voice strong and confident. "It's great to be here with you today." "Hello, Mr. Rose," the children responded in unison, their voices echoing off the gymnasium walls. Pete began his presentation by showing them some of his memorabilia and telling them about growing up in Cincinnati. He talked about the importance of practicing every day, of never giving up when things got difficult, and of treating teammates and opponents with respect. The children listened intently, asking enthusiastic questions about everything from his batting average to his favorite breakfast cereal. As Pete spoke, he found himself genuinely enjoying the interaction. These kids were engaged and curious, their questions showing both innocence and surprising insight. When he told them about breaking Ty Cobb's hitting record, they gasped with appropriate amazement. When he explained how many hours he had to practice to get good at baseball, they nodded solemnly, understanding that success required hard work. But it was during a quiet moment, as Pete paused to take a sip of water, that he noticed her. In the third row, sitting slightly apart from her classmates, was a little girl who couldn't have been more than 9 years old. She had long, dark hair that was neatly braided, but slightly unkempt, as if she had done it herself that morning. Her clothes were clean, but obviously old. A faded purple sweater that was too large for her small frame, and jeans that had been patched at the knees. But what caught Pete's attention, what made his heart skip a beat, was that she was barefoot, not wearing old shoes or worn-out sneakers, completely barefoot. Her small feet were tucked underneath her as she sat cross-legged in her chair, but Pete could see them clearly. They were clean but showed signs of walking on hard surfaces without protection. In the chilly October weather, when everyone else was bundled up in jackets and closed-toe shoes, this little girl had come to school without anything on her feet. Pete tried to continue his presentation, but his attention kept drifting back to the barefoot girl. She was listening intently to every word he said, her dark eyes fixed on him with the kind of focus that suggested she was absorbing every detail. When other children laughed at his jokes, she smiled. When they gasped at his stories, she leaned forward with interest. She was clearly engaged and interested, but there was something in her expression, a maturity, a seriousness that seemed beyond her years. Pete found himself wondering about her story. Why was she barefoot? Where were her shoes? Did her family not have money for proper footwear, or was there some other explanation? The more he thought about it, the more troubled he became. Here was a child who had come to school, eager to learn and participate, despite lacking something as basic as shoes for her feet. As he concluded his formal presentation and opened the floor for questions, Pete made a decision. He would find a way to help this little girl, but he needed to do it carefully, respectfully, without embarrassing her or drawing unwanted attention to her situation. "Does anyone have any more questions for Mr. Rose?" Margaret asked from her seat in the front row. Several hands shot up immediately, including the barefoot girl's. Pete pointed to her, curious to hear her voice. She stood up slowly, her bare feet touching the cold gymnasium floor. "Mr. Rose," she said in a clear, sweet voice that carried perfectly in the quiet space, "when you were little and didn't have much money, how did you keep believing that you could still achieve your dreams?" The question hit Pete like a fastball to the chest. This wasn't the typical question he got from children. Usually they wanted to know about his most exciting games or his favorite teammates. This was a question that spoke to real understanding of struggle, real awareness of the challenges that poverty could create for a child's aspirations. Pete looked directly at the little girl, seeing in her eyes a wisdom and resilience that both impressed and broke his heart. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently. "Isabella," she replied, sitting back down and tucking her feet underneath her again. "Isabella," Pete repeated, his voice softer now, more personal. "That's a beautiful name, and that's a very important question you asked." He paused, gathering his thoughts, knowing that his answer would matter not just to Isabella, but to many of the children in that room who were facing their own economic hardships. "When I was growing up, my family didn't have a lot of money either," Pete began. "There were times when I wanted things we couldn't afford. Better equipment, nicer clothes, toys that other kids had. But my parents taught me something very important. Your dreams don't cost money. Your dreams live inside your heart and your mind, and no one can take them away from you unless you let them." Isabella nodded solemnly, absorbing every word. "The most important things you need to achieve your dreams, like working hard, being kind to others, never giving up, and always trying your best. Those things are free," Pete continued. "They don't cost anything except your effort and your heart. And from what I can see here today, You Lincoln Lions have plenty of both." The gymnasium erupted in applause, and Pete noticed that several teachers were wiping away tears. Margaret Stevens was beaming with pride, clearly moved by the connection Pete was making with her students. As the assembly concluded and children began filing out for lunch, Pete lingered, hoping to catch another glimpse of Isabella. He watched as she stood up, carefully placing her bare feet on the cold floor, and joined the line of students heading toward the door. She moved with dignity and grace despite her obvious circumstances, and Pete felt a surge of admiration for her courage and resilience. Pete Rose had come to Lincoln Elementary thinking he might have something to offer these children. But as he watched Isabella disappear into the hallway, he realized that she had already given him something far more valuable. A reminder of what true strength looked like, and a renewed sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. The real impact of this visit was just beginning. After the assembly concluded, Pete lingered in the gymnasium as teachers efficiently guided their students toward the cafeteria for lunch. Margaret Stevens approached him with a warm smile, but Pete could see the emotion in her eyes. "Mr. Rose, that was absolutely wonderful," she said, her voice slightly thick with feeling. "I haven't seen our kids that engaged in months. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here." Pete nodded absently, his mind still focused on Isabella. "Margaret," he said quietly, "the little girl who asked me that question about believing in dreams. Isabella, can you tell me about her situation?" Margaret's expression grew more serious. She glanced around the gymnasium to make sure they were alone before speaking. "Isabella Martinez. She's in 4th grade, one of our brightest students. Her teacher, Mrs. Chen, says she's reading at a 7th grade level and excels in mathematics. But," she paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully, "I noticed she wasn't wearing shoes," Pete said gently. Margaret sighed deeply. "Isabella lives with her grandmother, Elena. Her parents both work multiple jobs. Her father does construction and landscaping. Her mother cleans office buildings at night and works at a grocery store during the day. They're good people, Mr. Rose, working as hard as they can, but it's a constant struggle. Elena speaks limited English, and she's been taking care of Isabella since she was very young." Pete absorbed this information, feeling a growing ache in his chest. "What happened to her shoes?" "From what I understand, Isabella had a growth spurt recently. Her shoes became too small and were causing blisters, so Elena told her to leave them at home until they could find a way to get new ones. That was about 3 weeks ago." Margaret's voice dropped even lower. "Elena is too proud to accept what she sees as charity from the school, but too stretched financially to prioritize new shoes when there's barely enough money for food and rent." Pete was quiet for a moment, processing this information. 3 weeks. This little girl had been coming to school barefoot for 3 weeks in October weather because her family couldn't afford new shoes. Yet she had still shown up every day, ready to learn, asking thoughtful questions about perseverance and believing in dreams. "Has anyone tried to help?" Pete asked. "Several staff members have offered, but Elena always politely declines. There's a lot of pride in that family, and a lot of fear too. They're undocumented, Mr. Rose. Elena is terrified that accepting help will draw attention to their situation. She's more afraid of deportation than of Isabella going without shoes." This information hit Pete like a physical blow. Not only was this family struggling economically, but they were living with the constant fear of being separated. Every day, Elena had to make impossible choices: accept help and risk exposure, or watch her granddaughter suffer in silence. "Where is Isabella now?" Pete asked. "Probably in the cafeteria with her class. She always eats lunch at school. It's often the most substantial meal of her day." Pete made a decision. "I'd like to do something to help, but I want to do it right. I don't want to embarrass Isabella or put the family at risk. Can you help me figure out the best way?" Margaret's face lit up with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Mr. Rose, that's incredibly kind of you. Let me think." She was quiet for a moment, clearly considering the various complications involved. "What if we approached it as a general donation to the school, rather than something specifically for Isabella? We could say that you wanted to contribute some shoes and winter items for any students who might need them." Pete nodded thoughtfully. "That could work. But I want to make sure Isabella gets what she needs without it feeling like a handout. Is there a way we can let her choose?" Margaret's eyes brightened. "Actually, yes. We have a small room where we keep donated items. Clothing, school supplies, things like that. Students can visit discreetly if they need something. We could stock it with shoes in various sizes and let word spread naturally that there are new items available." "Perfect," Pete said. "What sizes would Isabella need?" "Probably a size 2 or 3 in children's. She's small for her age, but growing quickly." Pete checked his watch. It was just past noon, and most stores would be open. "Is there a shopping center nearby? There's a Target about 10 minutes away and a Payless shoe store in the strip mall next to it." Pete reached for his wallet. "I'm going to go pick up some shoes and other items. Can I bring them back this afternoon?" Margaret looked surprised. "Mr. Rose, you don't have to do this. I mean, it's incredibly generous, but—" "Margaret," Pete interrupted gently, "that little girl reminded me today why I fell in love with baseball in the first place. It wasn't about the fame or the records or the money. It was about the joy of playing the game, the satisfaction of giving everything you had, and the feeling that you were part of something bigger than yourself. Isabella is giving everything she has every single day, and she's doing it barefoot. The least I can do is make sure she has proper shoes." Pete spent the next 2 hours shopping with more care and attention than he had given to anything in years. At Target, he selected several pairs of children's shoes in sizes 1 through 4, making sure to include both athletic shoes and casual shoes in styles that would be appropriate for a young girl. He chose warm socks, including some with fun patterns that he thought Isabella might enjoy. He also picked up winter coats, hats, and gloves in various sizes, but Pete didn't stop there. At a nearby bookstore, he purchased several chapter books appropriate for advanced young readers, thinking of what Margaret had said about Isabella's reading level. He also bought school supplies, notebooks, pencils, crayons, and other items that he suspected might be in short supply in the students' homes. As Pete loaded his purchases into his car, he reflected on how good it felt to be taking action, to be doing something concrete to help. For years, since his exile from baseball, he had felt useless, forgotten, like a man without purpose. But today, inspired by a barefoot little girl's courage and dignity, he felt alive in a way he hadn't experienced in decades. When Pete returned to Lincoln Elementary that afternoon, he found Margaret waiting for him in the main office. Together, they carried his purchases to the small room Margaret had mentioned, a former janitor's closet that had been converted into a discreet resource center for students and families in need. "This is amazing," Margaret said, as they organized the items on shelves. "The kids are going to be so excited, and the timing is perfect. We're heading into winter, and many of our families struggle to afford warm clothing for their children." "How do we let Isabella know without making it obvious?" Pete asked. Margaret smiled. "Mrs. Chen, Isabella's teacher, is very tactful about these things. She'll find a way to mention that new items are available, maybe suggest that Isabella help her organize the room after school. Once Isabella sees the shoes, she'll understand that they're available if she needs them." Pete arranged the shoes carefully, making sure that the ones in Isabella's size were prominently displayed. He had chosen a pair of pink and purple sneakers that he thought she might like, along with some more practical brown shoes that would go with anything. "There's one more thing I'd like to do," Pete said. "I'd like to set up a small fund, something ongoing that could help with situations like this throughout the school year. Would the school be able to manage something like that?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Rose, I don't know what to say. That would make such a difference for so many of our families. You don't need to say anything, Pete replied. Just make sure that kids like Isabella know that someone believes in their dreams, even when things are tough. As Pete prepared to leave Lincoln Elementary that afternoon, he felt a satisfaction and sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for years. He had no way of knowing whether Isabella would find the shoes, whether she would feel comfortable taking them, or whether his gesture would make any real difference in her life. But he knew that he had tried to help, and that trying felt better than the passive resignation that had characterized his recent years. Driving home through the streets of Cincinnati, Pete reflected on the unexpected turn his day had taken. He had arrived at Lincoln Elementary thinking he was doing a favor for underprivileged children, sharing his experience and maybe inspiring them to work hard and pursue their goals. Instead, he had been reminded of something fundamental about human dignity and resilience. Isabella, with her thoughtful question and her quiet courage, had taught him more in those few minutes than he had learned in years of self-pity and regret. That evening, Pete called Margaret to follow up. "How did it go?" he asked. "Did Isabella find the shoes?" Margaret's voice was warm with emotion. "She did, Mr. Rose. Mrs. Chen asked her to help tidy up the resource room after school, and Isabella saw the shoes immediately. She tried on the pink and purple sneakers, and they fit perfectly. Mrs. Chen said she's never seen a child's face light up quite like that." Pete felt a warmth spreading through his chest. "Did she say anything?" She asked Mrs. Chen if it would be okay to take them home to show her grandmother. When Mrs. Chen assured her that the shoes were meant for students who needed them, Isabella just stood there for a moment, holding the shoes against her chest. Then she said, "Maybe Mr. Rose was right about dreams not costing money, but sometimes dreams need shoes." Pete had to take a moment to compose himself before responding. "That little girl is something special." "She certainly is," Margaret agreed. "And Mr. Rose, you should know that word is already spreading about your generosity. Several other families have quietly stopped by to see what's available. You've started something really wonderful here." After hanging up, Pete sat in his living room surrounded by his baseball memorabilia, but for the first time in years, he wasn't dwelling on his past glory or his subsequent fall from grace. Instead, he was thinking about Isabella Martinez, a barefoot little girl who had reminded him that real champions aren't just the people who hit the most home runs or break the most records. Real champions are the people who keep showing up, who keep trying, who keep believing in their dreams, even when the odds are stacked against them. And sometimes, real champions are the people who help other champions find their shoes. 2 weeks after Pete's visit to Lincoln Elementary, Margaret Stevens called him with news that would forever change how he understood the ripple effects of kindness. "Mr. Rose," her voice carried an excitement that was immediately infectious. "You need to hear what's been happening here since your visit. It's absolutely remarkable." Pete was sitting in his kitchen, nursing his morning coffee and reading the sports section, a habit that had become both comforting and melancholic over the years. "I'm listening, Margaret." "First, Isabella," Margaret began. "She's been wearing those pink and purple sneakers every day, and Mrs. Chen says there's been a complete transformation in her confidence. She's participating more in class discussions, volunteering to help other students, and yesterday she joined the after-school tutoring program where she's helping younger kids with their reading." Pete smiled, imagining the little girl who had asked him about believing in dreams, despite poverty, now helping other children learn to read. "That's wonderful, but I have a feeling there's more." "Oh, there's much more," Margaret continued. "Isabella went home and told her grandmother about your visit, about what you said regarding dreams being free, but sometimes needing support to flourish. Elena Martinez came to see me yesterday afternoon." Pete leaned forward, intrigued. He remembered Margaret explaining how protective and proud Isabella's grandmother was, how reluctant to accept help. Elena brought homemade tamales for the entire teaching staff, Margaret explained. She wanted to thank us, but more than that, she wanted to contribute. Through Isabella's translation, she explained that she has skills. She's an excellent seamstress and cook, and she wants to volunteer at the school. She's offered to help with costume alterations for our winter play and to assist in the cafeteria during busy periods. Pete felt a lump forming in his throat. She wants to give back. Exactly. But here's the truly amazing part. Eleanor's story has inspired other parents in similar situations. We've had 5 more families volunteer to help in various ways over the past 2 weeks. Parents who previously felt they had nothing to offer because they didn't speak perfect English or didn't have college educations now realize they have valuable skills and experiences to share. Pete set down his coffee cup, fully absorbed in Margaret's account. What kind of skills? Everything you can imagine. One father who works as a mechanic has offered to teach basic car maintenance to our older students. A mother who's a professional house cleaner wants to teach life skills classes about organization and cleanliness. Another parent who works in construction wants to help with maintenance projects around the school. It's like your act of kindness toward Isabella gave the entire community permission to contribute their own forms of kindness. Pete was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what Margaret was describing. He had bought shoes for a little girl, but somehow that simple act had catalyzed an entire community to recognize and share their own strengths. There's more, Margaret continued. The story has spread beyond our school community. Mrs. Chen mentioned Isabella's transformation to her neighbor, who happens to be a reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer. She's interested in writing a human interest story about community support in urban schools. Pete felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Media attention had not been kind to him in recent years, and he was reluctant to have his past mistakes dragged into a story that should be about Isabella and her community. Margaret seemed to sense his concern. Don't worry. The focus would be entirely on the positive impact on our students and families. Your privacy would be completely protected if that's what you prefer. I appreciate that, Margaret, but honestly, I'm more interested in hearing about how Isabella is doing than in any publicity. She's thriving, Mr. Rose, and she's asked if she could write you a thank you letter. Would that be something you'd like to receive? Pete's answer was immediate and definitive. I would love nothing more. 3 days later, Pete found a manila envelope in his mailbox addressed in careful 4th-grade handwriting. Inside was a letter written on lined paper, decorated with colored pencil drawings of baseball diamonds and flowers. Dear Mr. Rose, the letter began. Thank you for coming to our school and for helping me get shoes. But I want to thank you for something more important than shoes. You taught me that having dreams is not something to be ashamed of, even when your family doesn't have much money. You taught me that working hard and being kind are the most valuable things a person can have. Pete paused in his reading, already feeling emotional about this little girl's wisdom and gratitude. The letter continued. My abuela, grandmother, was worried about me going to school without shoes because she thought other kids would make fun of me. But you showed me that what matters is not what we don't have, but what we do with what we do have. I have a brain that loves to learn, hands that like to help other people, and a heart that believes in dreams. Those are better than the fanciest shoes in the world, but it's nice to have both. Pete chuckled through his tears at Isabella's practical assessment. I wanted you to know that my abuela is now helping at our school, and she feels proud instead of worried. She says that in Mexico, where she grew up, communities always helped each other, and now she feels like we have that same kind of community here. She says you reminded her that accepting help and giving help are both important parts of being a good neighbor. The letter went on to describe Isabella's academic progress, her new friendships, and her goal of becoming a teacher someday so she could help other children believe in their dreams. She concluded with a promise that made Pete's heart swell with pride. "I promise to always remember what you taught us about dreams being free, but sometimes needing support to grow. When I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who helps other people's dreams grow too." Pete read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of insight and maturity from this remarkable 9-year-old. He carefully folded it and placed it in a frame on his kitchen table, where he could see it every morning with his coffee. But Isabella's letter was just the beginning of the changes that began unfolding in Pete's life. Margaret called again the following week with an invitation that surprised him. "Mr. Rose, I know you said you weren't interested in publicity, but I have a different kind of proposal. The school district has asked if you'd be willing to speak at other schools in similar communities. Not for media attention or recognition, but because what you started here at Lincoln Elementary is exactly the kind of community engagement that these schools need." Pete considered this carefully. A month ago, he would have declined, convinced that he had nothing valuable to offer, but Isabella had changed his perspective on what it meant to be valuable, what it meant to contribute, what it meant to matter. "What would I talk about?" he asked. "The same things you talked about here: perseverance, hard work, believing in dreams despite difficult circumstances. But mostly, I think you talk about seeing potential in every child, regardless of their economic situation." Pete thought about Isabella's question about believing in dreams when you don't have much money. He thought about her grandmother's pride and fear, and how a simple act of kindness had transformed both into community engagement and hope. "How many schools are we talking about?" Pete asked. "There are 12 elementary schools in the district serving similar communities," Margaret explained. "If you visited one school per month, you could reach thousands of children over the course of a year. And based on what we've seen here, the impact would extend far beyond the students to their families and the broader community." Pete was quiet for several minutes, considering the magnitude of what Margaret was proposing. 12 schools, thousands of children, countless families who might benefit from the kind of community engagement that had blossomed at Lincoln Elementary. "I'll do it," Pete said finally. "But I have some conditions." "Of course. What do you need?" "First, I want to establish a fund that can provide immediate assistance for basic needs, shoes, winter coats, school supplies, at each school I visit. Second, I want to work with local community members to identify ways they can contribute their skills and talents. And third, I want to stay in touch with the students. I want to know how they're doing, how their families are doing, whether our efforts are making a real difference." Margaret's voice was filled with emotion when she responded. "Mr. Rose, what you're describing isn't just a speaking engagement. It's a comprehensive community outreach program. Are you sure you want to take on something that extensive?" Pete thought about his empty days before visiting Lincoln Elementary, the sense of purposelessness that had defined his post-baseball years. Then he thought about Isabella's letter, about Elena Martinez making tamales for teachers, about parents discovering that their skills and experiences had value. "Margaret," Pete said, "for the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Charlie Hustle isn't just about running hard to first base. It's about giving everything you have to something that matters. These kids matter. Their families matter. Their communities matter." Over the following months, Pete Rose embarked on what would become known throughout Cincinnati as the Dreams and Dignity Tour. At each school he visited, he followed the same pattern that had worked so well at Lincoln Elementary. He would speak to the students about perseverance, hard work, and believing in themselves regardless of their circumstances. He would establish a discrete resource fund for immediate needs. And most importantly, he would work with school administrators to identify and engage community members who could contribute their talents and skills. The results were consistently remarkable. At Riverside Elementary, a father who worked as a professional chef began teaching cooking classes that emphasized nutrition and budgeting. At Washington Elementary, a mother who had immigrated from Somalia started an after-school program teaching traditional crafts while helping students with homework. At Kennedy Elementary, a grandfather who had worked as an electrician for 40 years began teaching basic electrical safety and maintenance skills. But perhaps most importantly, Pete maintained personal connections with students at each school. He received dozens of letters from children sharing their dreams, their challenges, and their progress. He attended school plays, science fairs, and graduation ceremonies. He celebrated successes and provided encouragement during difficult times. Isabella Martinez remained his most faithful correspondent. Her letters arrived monthly, filled with updates about her academic achievements, her grandmother's growing involvement at Lincoln Elementary, and her evolving dreams of becoming a teacher. Through her letters, Pete learned about the broader changes in her community, how parents who had once felt isolated and powerless now felt connected and valued, how children who had once been embarrassed by their economic circumstances now understood that their worth wasn't determined by their material possessions. As Pete's first year of school visits drew to a close, he received an unexpected phone call from the Cincinnati Board of Education. The superintendent wanted to meet with him about formalizing his community outreach program and expanding it district-wide. "Mr. Rose," Superintendent Patricia Williams explained during their meeting, "what you've accomplished in these 12 schools has been extraordinary. Student engagement is up, parent involvement has increased dramatically, and we're seeing measurable improvements in academic performance. The board would like to offer you a position as Community Liaison Coordinator with a salary and benefits that would allow you to do this work full-time." Pete was stunned. He had never imagined that his informal efforts to help children like Isabella would evolve into a professional opportunity. What would that position involve? "You would work with all 63 elementary schools in our district, helping them develop community engagement programs based on the model you've created. You'd have an office, administrative support, and a budget for the kind of immediate assistance funds you've been establishing. Most importantly, you'd be able to reach thousands more children and families." Pete thought about his small apartment, his collection of baseball memorabilia, his days spent reading the sports section and dwelling on his past mistakes. Then he thought about Isabella's question about believing in dreams despite difficult circumstances, and about how answering that question had transformed his own life. "I accept," Pete said without hesitation. "But I have one request." "What's that?" "I want Isabella Martinez to be the first student I visit in my new role. I want to tell her personally that her courage and wisdom helped an old baseball player remember what it means to be truly valuable." 2 weeks later, Pete Rose returned to Lincoln Elementary for his first official visit as Community Liaison Coordinator for Cincinnati Public Schools. As he walked through the familiar hallways, he noticed changes that spoke to the ongoing impact of community engagement. Parent volunteers were everywhere, helping in classrooms, organizing the library, supervising recess activities. The walls displayed new artwork and projects that clearly showed increased student pride and participation. Margaret Stevens met him at the door with her characteristic warm smile, but Pete could see that she was barely containing her excitement about something. "Mr. Rose, I have some wonderful news to share with you, but first, I want you to see someone." Margaret led him to Mrs. Chen's 4th grade classroom, where Isabella was working with a small group of 2nd graders, helping them sound out difficult words in their reading books. She was wearing the pink and purple sneakers Pete had provided months earlier, but now they were paired with a confident smile and a manner of speaking that showed how much she had grown. When Isabella looked up and saw Pete, Her face lit up with joy and recognition. "Mr. Rose," she exclaimed, jumping up to greet him. "Mrs. Stevens said you might visit us again." Pete knelt down to Isabella's level, noting how much taller she had grown in the months since their first meeting. "Hello, Isabella. I wanted to come back and tell you something important." Isabella looked at him with the same serious attention she had shown during their first encounter. "I wanted you to know that you changed my life," Pete said simply. "When you asked me that question about believing in dreams when you don't have much money, you reminded me of something I had forgotten. You reminded me that the most important thing isn't what we've lost or what we don't have. It's what we do with what we do have. You taught an old baseball player how to be a champion again." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. "Does this mean you're going to help other kids like you helped us?" "That's exactly what it means," Pete replied. "I'm going to visit schools all over Cincinnati, and I'm going to tell them about a brave little girl who came to school barefoot but never stopped believing in her dreams. I'm going to tell them that dreams don't cost money, but sometimes dreams need people who believe in them." Isabella hugged Pete tightly, and he felt a profound sense of completion, as if all the victories and defeats of his baseball career had been leading to this moment, to this understanding of what it truly meant to matter. As Pete prepared to leave Lincoln Elementary that day, Margaret walked him to his car and shared the news she had been saving. "Isabella has been accepted into the district's accelerated learning program," she announced. "She'll be able to take advanced courses while staying here at Lincoln Elementary for the community connections. But Mr. Rose, the best part is what she told Mrs. Chen when she learned about the program." "What did she say?" Margaret smiled through tears of pride. She said, "This is good, because now I can learn faster how to be a teacher. I want to help other kids believe in their dreams, just like Mr. Rose helped me believe in mine." 5 years after Pete Rose first visited Lincoln Elementary, the impact of that chance encounter with Isabella Martinez had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined. The Dreams and Dignity program had become a model for community engagement that school districts across Ohio and neighboring states were eager to replicate. Pete's official role as community liaison coordinator had evolved into something much larger. He had become a recognized expert in building bridges between schools and the communities they served. On a crisp October morning, Pete stood in the auditorium of Cincinnati's Convention Center, preparing to address the National Conference on Urban Education. The audience consisted of educators, administrators, and community leaders from across the country, all gathered to learn about innovative approaches to supporting students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Pete had been invited as the keynote speaker, a recognition that still felt surreal to someone who had spent years believing his best contributions were behind him. But as Pete looked out at the audience of nearly 2,000 people, his mind wasn't focused on his prepared remarks about community partnerships and asset-based thinking. Instead, he was thinking about Isabella Martinez, who was now a confident 14-year-old freshman at Cincinnati School for Creative and Performing Arts, having earned admission through her exceptional academic performance and her passion for education and community service. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pete began, his voice carrying the confidence that had returned to him over the past 5 years, "I want to tell you about a little girl who taught a washed-up baseball player the true meaning of championship." He told them about that first visit to Lincoln Elementary, about seeing Isabella sitting barefoot in the assembly, about her question regarding belief in dreams despite economic hardship. He described the simple act of buying shoes and how it had catalyzed an entire community to recognize and share their own assets and strengths. The traditional model of helping economically disadvantaged communities is based on a deficit mindset. Pete explained, "We look at what people don't have, what they're lacking, what they need us to provide." But Isabella and her grandmother, Eleanor, taught me about an asset-based mindset, recognizing and building on the incredible strengths, skills, and resilience that already exist in these communities. Pete went on to share statistics about the Dreams and Dignity program's impact. Parent involvement in participating schools had increased by an average of 340%, student academic performance had improved significantly, and perhaps most importantly, surveys showed dramatic increases in students' sense of hope and belief in their own potential. But numbers don't tell the real story, Pete continued. The real story is about transformation, not just of individual students, but of entire communities learning to see themselves as assets rather than deficits, as contributors rather than recipients. After his presentation, Pete was surrounded by educators, eager to learn more about implementing similar programs in their own districts. He spent hours answering questions, sharing resources, and connecting people with the tools they needed to build community partnerships. But throughout the day, he found himself checking his phone for a text message he was expecting from Isabella. That evening, as Pete drove back to Cincinnati, his phone finally buzzed with the message he had been waiting for. "Mr. Rose, I got accepted to volunteer at the elementary school reading program. My first assignment is helping kids who are struggling with confidence about their dreams. I think I know something about that. Thank you for teaching me that helping others helps us find ourselves." Pete pulled into a gas station parking lot so he could respond properly to Isabella's message. Over the years, their correspondence had evolved from her childhood letters, thanking him for shoes, to substantive conversations about education, community service, and social justice. Isabella had become not just a success story from his program, but a genuine friend and collaborator in his work. "Congratulations, Isabella," Pete typed back. "I'm so proud of you, and I know you're going to inspire those kids just like you inspired me. Remember, champions aren't made in the spotlight. They're made in moments like these, when someone chooses to lift up someone else." As Pete drove through the streets of Cincinnati, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that day he had reluctantly agreed to speak at Lincoln Elementary. His small apartment had been replaced by a comfortable house in a neighborhood where children walked safely to well-funded schools. His collection of baseball memorabilia was still prominently displayed, but now it shared wall space with photographs from school visits, thank you letters from students, and awards recognizing his community service work. But the most significant change wasn't in his living situation or his professional recognition. It was in his sense of purpose and identity. For years after his exile from baseball, Pete had defined himself primarily by his past mistakes and missed opportunities. Now at 67, he understood that his most important contributions had nothing to do with his baseball career and everything to do with his willingness to see potential in a barefoot little girl and to act on that recognition. Pete's phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. The caller ID showed Margaret Stevens, who was now Superintendent of Elementary Education for Cincinnati Public Schools, having been promoted in recognition of the dramatic improvements in her district's community engagement and student outcomes. "Pete, I hope I'm not calling too late," Margaret said, "but I have some news I couldn't wait until morning to share." "I'm listening," Pete replied, settling into his favorite chair, the same worn leather recliner from his old apartment, which he had kept as a reminder of how far he had come. "The Department of Education wants to fund a national pilot program based on Dreams and Dignity," Margaret announced. 20 cities, 5 years, full federal support. They want you to lead the program development and implementation. Pete was quiet for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what Margaret was telling him. A national program would mean reaching hundreds of thousands of students, supporting countless families, and potentially transforming how the entire country approached education in economically disadvantaged communities. That's incredible, Margaret. But I need to ask you something honestly. Do you think I'm the right person for something that big? 5 years ago, I was a has-been sitting alone in my apartment feeling sorry for myself. Margaret's response was immediate and definitive. Pete, you're absolutely the right person, and I'll tell you why. This program works because it's based on authentic human connection, on seeing and believing in people's potential even when they can't see it themselves. That's exactly what Isabella did for you, and it's what you've been doing for thousands of students ever since. The federal government can provide funding and infrastructure, but what they can't provide is the heart and authenticity that makes this work. That has to come from someone who understands what it feels like to be written off, to be seen as a mistake rather than a person with continued potential. Pete thought about Isabella's original question about believing in dreams despite difficult circumstances. He thought about Elena Martinez's pride and fear, and how recognizing her assets rather than her deficits had transformed both her self-perception and her community contributions. He thought about the thousands of students he had met over the past 5 years, each one teaching him something new about resilience, hope, and human potential. All right, Pete said finally. Let's do it. But I have some conditions. Margaret laughed. I had a feeling you might. What do you need? First, I want Isabella Martinez involved in the program design. She's starting high school, but she has insights about reaching struggling students that no adult can provide. Second, I want to make sure we're not just replicating what we've done here. I want each community to develop their own version based on their specific assets and needs. And third, I want to maintain the personal connections. This can't become a bureaucratic program that loses sight of individual students and families. Those all sound like excellent conditions, Margaret replied. The Department of Education specifically mentioned wanting to preserve the personal, community-based approach that makes dreams and dignity so effective. After hanging up with Margaret, Pete sat quietly in his living room, surrounded by reminders of both his baseball career and his community service work. On his mantle, his National League championship rings sat next to a photograph of Isabella at her 8th grade graduation, wearing a cap and gown and holding a certificate recognizing her as the top student in her class. Pete picked up the photograph and studied Isabella's face, still the same serious, thoughtful expression she had worn as a 9-year-old, but now accompanied by a confidence and sense of purpose that radiated from her smile. In her graduation speech, which Pete had attended, Isabella had spoken about the importance of recognizing that every person has gifts to share, even when those gifts don't look like what society expects. Some people think successful students come from families with lots of money and resources, Isabella had said to her graduating class. But I learned from someone very wise that the most important resources, like determination, kindness, and the ability to work hard, don't cost anything. They live inside our hearts, and no one can take them away from us unless we let them. Pete had found himself in tears that day, not just because of pride in Isabella's accomplishments, but because of gratitude for how much she had taught him about recognizing and nurturing potential in unexpected places. Now, as he prepared to embark on a national program that could impact hundreds of thousands of students, Pete felt the same mixture of excitement and responsibility that he had experienced before important baseball games. But this was bigger than baseball. This was about giving children across America the chance to believe in their dreams, regardless of their economic circumstances. Pete's phone buzzed with another text message. This one from Elena Martinez. Mr. Pete, Isabella told me about your new job helping kids everywhere. I am making extra tamales this week to celebrate. You changed our family's life, and now you will change many more families. Gracias por todo." Pete smiled, remembering the proud but fearful woman he had first heard about 5 years earlier, and comparing her to the confident community leader Elena had become. She now served on Lincoln Elementary's Parent Advisory Council and had started a non-profit organization teaching other immigrant families about navigating American educational systems while preserving their cultural identities. As Pete prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. His baseball career had given him fame, money, and recognition, but it had also led to mistakes, disappointments, and years of feeling like a failure. His community service work had given him something much more valuable, a sense of purpose, genuine human connections, and the knowledge that his life was making a positive difference in the world. Tomorrow, Pete would begin planning a national program that could transform how America approaches education in economically disadvantaged communities. He would work with federal officials, education researchers, and community leaders from across the country. But at the heart of everything he did would be the memory of a barefoot little girl who had asked him about believing in dreams despite difficult circumstances, and who had taught him that true champions are defined not by their victories or defeats, but by their willingness to see and nurture potential in others. Pete Rose had spent his baseball career earning the nickname Charlie Hustle for his relentless energy and determination. Now, at 67, he was discovering that the most important hustle of his life had nothing to do with running to first base, and everything to do with running toward opportunities to help others believe in themselves. The barefoot girl had become a confident young woman with unlimited potential. The washed-up baseball player had become a national leader in community-based education. And together, their story had become proof that the most powerful transformations happen when we choose to see assets instead of deficits, potential instead of problems, and dreams instead of limitations. The legacy Pete Rose would ultimately leave had nothing to do with batting averages or hit records. It had everything to do with a simple truth Isabella Martinez had taught him on a cold October morning: that champions are made not in moments of personal glory, but in moments when they choose to help someone else believe in their own worth. And in cities across America, thousands of students would soon learn that their dreams didn't cost money, but that sometimes dreams needed someone to believe in them. Thanks to a barefoot girl's courage and an old ball player's willingness to learn, those students would find that someone in their own communities, in their own families, and ultimately in themselves. The greatest victory of Pete Rose's life had nothing to do with baseball, and everything to do with discovering that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, especially when that person is someone who helps others become who they were meant to be too.